For the record, my name is Mitsuaki, not Honey. The character used in my name happens to mean honey, and yes, I have heard every joke you can imagine. My parents probably thought it sounded nice. They were not the ones who had to survive years of teasing, especially after a wildly popular romance anime released with a heroine whose name sounded a little too close to mine. My co-workers never let that go. They kept asking whether I had come from another time. I wish I had, you jerks. Other than the unfortunate name, there was nothing remarkable about me. Average face, average life, no career worth bragging about. I bounced from one part-time job to another, doing whatever odd work paid the bills. The only extraordinary thing in my life was my dog, Biscuit. Every miserable shift and every dull day felt worth enduring if I could go home, feed him something good, take too many pictures of him, and waste the rest of the night buried in otaku hobbies with my best friend nearby. I knew exactly what kind of person I was. In any normal story, I would be an unnamed background character. Still, after getting hit by a truck, I thought the universe might finally give me the classic Isekai treatment. I had read the setup 100 times. Some ordinary loser gets flattened by a vehicle, wakes in a fantasy world with game mechanics, receives an absurd cheat skill, and becomes a legendary hero. That was not what happened to me. It started after dinner, during the same walk Biscuit and I took every day. A truck appeared so suddenly, it might as well have materialized out of nowhere. There was no dramatic warning, no heroic sacrifice, and no time to understand what was happening. One moment I was walking my dog. The next, everything was white. I came to in a blinding room and immediately checked myself for injuries. Nothing hurt. Better yet, Biscuit was there too, pressed behind my legs with his tail tucked down. Before I could decide whether being alive was good news, a melodic voice echoed through the empty space and addressed me as a child of man whose aid was required. Looking up, I saw a golden throne and the most beautiful woman I had ever seen at that point in my life. She had cloud-like silver-white hair, divine features, and an outfit that seemed designed around the minimum legal definition of coverage. She leaned against one arm of the throne with the expression of someone who knew everything and was deeply bored by all of it. I asked the obvious questions. Was she God? And was I dead? She only sighed. Apparently those were not interesting enough to deserve an answer. Instead, she tried to move straight into her explanation. She had brought me there to vanquish the demon lord of her world. To make things easy, she intended to boost my stats and send me out at level 99. According to her, level 99 always got the job done. A status screen appeared in front of me. I barely had time to read the first line before Biscuit cautiously poked his head out from behind my legs. The goddess froze, and whatever divine dignity she had been projecting vanished on the spot. Oh my goodness, how cute. She launched herself off the throne, crossed the room in an instant, and practically folded around Biscuit, the demon lord, the summoning, my death. And apparently my entire existence stopped mattering. She babbled about his fluffy face, his little body, his soft fur, and every other detail that had already convinced half my old neighborhood that Biscuit was more valuable than I was. For once, I could not even blame her. Biscuit is a fluffy Pomeranian with a permanent smile and enough fur to look twice his actual size. He is missing one eye, which was why nobody had wanted him at the rescue when I first saw him. I had stopped outside the window, seen that ridiculous smile staring back at me, and that had been the end of it. We had been inseparable ever since. The goddess cuddled him for several minutes before finally seeming to remember she had summoned a human too. She stood, cleared her throat, and tried to recover some authority. Child of man, you must protect this creature with your life. Now go. That was the entire briefing. The white room pixelated around us. The light broke into dark fragments, and the next thing I knew, Biscuit and I were standing in a forest at dusk. I checked myself again and immediately felt cheated. I had the same body, the same shorts, the same dirty sneakers, and the same t-shirt with a can of Silver Bounty sardines on the front. I had not even been granted a free haircut. Biscuit, meanwhile, had received a brand new golden harness and leash with a strange charm hanging from it. The charm showed a crooked circle around a symbol I could not read. Of course, the goddess had given him better equipment. Her favoritism had not even lasted 10 minutes before becoming obvious. Once Biscuit had dealt with the important business of finding a bush, I spent several frustrating minutes trying to reopen the status screen. When it finally appeared, I discovered exactly how badly things had gone. Level 1, Strength 10, no skills, and no assigned job. I tapped through every menu I could find, but there was no hidden class, no secret ability, and not even a pity bonus for being the summoned guy. I was a level 1 nobody in a dangerous fantasy world. The party tab was the only thing I had not checked. It contained a single name, Biscuit. He was wandering around peeing on trees when I called him, then trotted over happily as his name appeared above his head. I opened his status and nearly stopped breathing. Biscuit was level 99, had 999 strength, possessed acid shot, boost jump, barrier breaker, and sonic bark. And his assigned job was hero. I fell backward onto the ground. The goddess had given everything to my dog. Maybe it had been an accident. Maybe it had not. At that moment, either possibility was equally offensive. Biscuit was roughly the size of an electric mouse and weighed about as much as a stack of magazines I would rather not discuss. How was he supposed to defeat a demon lord? What did acid shot even mean? Was sonic bark a real skill, or was that stupid goddess mocking me? Biscuit, bored with my existential crisis, pawed at me until I rolled him over and rubbed his belly. While he enjoyed himself, I studied his skill tree. Many abilities were still locked and seemed to require skill points. That made no sense if he was already max level, so I pressed the information icon beside the SP counter. A message explained that skill points came from defeating monsters, could still be gained after max level, were not awarded through normal leveling, and were consumed when spent. The note was signed simply with an A. I had a strong suspicion that A stood for the goddess who had ruined my life. Before I could investigate further, a scream echoed somewhere in the forest. It sounded like a girl. Biscuit immediately rolled upright and barked toward the dark trees. I had just enough time to wonder whether that was a normal bark or his mysterious sonic bark, before a huge shadow pushed through the brush. The thing was nearly 3 meters tall. At first glance it resembled a moose, except no moose I knew stood upright on 2 legs. It reached toward me with one massive hoof. I never got the chance to dodge. A violent impact struck my side and threw me through the air. For one horrible second, I thought the monster had hit me. Then, while I was flying, I realized Biscuit had headbutted me out of the way. That tiny brute had launched me like luggage. I crashed into a bush and nearly blacked out from the pain in my ribs. I shouted for Biscuit, hoping he would run back so we could escape. Instead, he planted himself directly in front of a creature at least 50 times his size. What happened next destroyed whatever expectations I still had about heroic combat. Biscuit began gagging. His whole body convulsed with the familiar pre-vomit rhythm I knew far too well from years of him aiming for my books at home. Only this time, he was staring directly at the monster. A huge glob of wet slime blasted out of his mouth and struck the creature in the face. The forest filled with hissing. The monster roared, staggered, dropped to its knees, and collapsed as the slime ate through its face. Seconds later, its enormous body dissolved into pixels and vanished. Biscuit flashed with a small burst of light. I stared at him, speechless, and finally managed one conclusion. So that was acid shot. Ignoring the pain in my side, I crawled out of the bushes and scooped Biscuit into my arms. His status showed full health at 3000 HP. I did not know whether 3000 was impressive, but the bar was full, and that was enough for me. I held him tightly, more relieved than I wanted to admit. A small voice spoke behind me before I could check anything else. That was amazing. I turned and immediately forgot how language worked. A young woman stepped out from the tree line, her hair a soft cloud of messy pink curls. She wore a simple old dress and a work apron. Nothing remotely glamorous, and somehow she was still the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Yes, I had said that about the goddess less than an hour earlier. This time I meant it. Probably. She rushed toward us, full of excitement, praising what she thought had been an incredible battle. According to her, the monster had been terrorizing the nearby village for weeks. Nobody had dared challenge something so high level. That information made me glance at Biscuit with a little more respect and a lot more concern. The girl, meanwhile, had already built an entire explanation around us. The golden emblem on Biscuit's harness convinced her he was my Vera partner. In this world, powerful people could form contracts with Veras after defeating legendary monsters, and those Veras were usually smaller versions of the creatures they came from. Since Biscuit was so cute and still clearly powerful, she decided he must have once been some kind of astral wolf. Biscuit puffed out his chest like he understood every word. I tried not to expose how little I knew. The safest strategy was to nod whenever she explained something and let her fill in the gaps herself. Unfortunately, the movement reminded me of my injured ribs, and I winced. Her excitement immediately turned to concern. She insisted I return to the village with her and see the healer. A moment later, she called me Mr. Hero. I knew that title was going to become a problem. I also knew I liked hearing it from her far too much. She helped me to my feet, and I caught the scent of fresh pears in her hair. We talked during the walk, mostly with me carefully avoiding details about where I had come from. My long history of part-time jobs sounded impressive to her, because she interpreted everything through the assumption that I was some wandering hero with a broad range of experience. The more she admired me, the worse the lie felt. The more she kept supporting me with my arm around her shoulders, the less motivated I became to correct it. By the time we reached the village, I was already fantasizing about a cozy fantasy life that absolutely did not belong to me. The village looked like the starting town of an RPG. Small wooden houses, narrow streets, warm lights behind a few late windows, and the general feeling that someone should be waiting nearby to ask me to collect 10 herbs. Biscuit wanted to investigate everything, but I kept calling him back whenever he wandered too far. The girl led us to a healer's house and knocked loudly. Biscuit immediately hid behind me. Back home, he had been terrified of sudden sounds when I first adopted him, and some of those old nerves seemed to have returned in this unfamiliar world. The door opened to reveal an elderly woman wearing what I can only describe as a nightgown with far more confidence than fabric. She was furious at being disturbed because it was her anniversary. As she bluntly explained, we were killing the mood. That was not how I imagined my first proper NPC interaction going. The pink-haired girl apologized, asked after the healer's husband Osric, then finally explained that she had found a hero injured after fighting the monster in the woods. The old woman looked at me once, lifted a hand, and cast Great Heal. Green light flashed over my body. A heartbeat later, she slammed the door in our faces. I actually blurted, "That's it." The girl only assumed the healer must have been tired. When I pressed my fingers into my side, the pain was gone. Completely. My disappointment at losing the excuse to keep my arm around her shoulders was quickly replaced by fascination. Magic was real, and I had just been healed in seconds. Naturally, my next thought was whether Biscuit could learn something similar. The girl then guided us to the village inn. As expected, the ground floor doubled as a tavern. Drunken patrons sang about heroes and legends. Stairs climbed along one wall, and a broad innkeeper named Hilda stood behind the counter. Biscuit immediately tried to mark a stool. I nudged him away with my foot before he could destroy my first impression. The pink-haired girl proudly announced that she had brought a hero who had defeated the boss monster in the woods. The tavern quieted. Hilda did not believe her at first, but once the girl explained what she had seen and demanded that I show my Vera partner, I lifted Biscuit like a rare item. Hilda's eyes lit up. She recovered quickly. But I knew that look. Women in my old neighborhood had made the same face whenever Biscuit appeared. The moment everyone saw the goddess's emblem and accepted him as a Vera, all doubt vanished. The tavern erupted. Villagers surrounded us with congratulations, gratitude, and drinks. They kept a respectful distance from Biscuit, which was strange after years of strangers immediately grabbing for him. But they treated me with overwhelming warmth. They slapped my back, laughed, thanked me for saving their home, and called me a hero with complete sincerity. I had spent most of my old life feeling invisible. For a little while, being seen felt incredible. Things escalated absurdly fast. I was taken from the inn to the largest house in the village, where people began bringing gifts as though I were royalty. Food, fabric, alcohol, gold, and even better clothes. A craftsman started making boots to replace my filthy sneakers. One woman massaged my shoulders and casually offered me her daughter. Biscuit happily demolished something that looked like smoked ham while the gifts kept piling up. One by one, the villagers went home, leaving us surrounded by the proof of how quickly a misunderstanding could become a miracle. Eventually, only Biscuit, the pink-haired girl, and I remained. That was when she suddenly gasped and realized we had never introduced ourselves. She pinched the sides of her dress, gave a small curtsy, and told me her name was Rinka. She asked whether she could return the next day to check on me. I could only nod. Hearing her name, after spending the entire evening imagining a future together like a complete idiot, somehow broke whatever composure I had left. Rinka left with another smile, and I floated upstairs to a bedroom far more luxurious than anything the village itself suggested. The bed looked big enough for 6 people. The pillows were absurdly soft. Back in Hoshima, one of them probably would have cost a month's rent. Biscuit curled near my feet the way he always did, and for the first time since arriving in this world, I convinced myself everything might actually work out. Maybe I could live comfortably here. Maybe people would keep treating me like a hero. Maybe Rinka could even become part of that life. I fell asleep thinking about her, completely unaware that my fantasy was going to collapse the very next morning. Morning sunlight came through the windows, while I stubbornly kept my eyes closed. I had spent the night dreaming about a life where I wanted for nothing, where people admired me, and where Rinka had somehow become my wife before I had even managed a normal conversation with her. The fantasy was especially ridiculous because women in my old life had barely noticed me. Biscuit was always the one they cared about. They took pictures of him, praised him, and crowded around him. If I tried to join the conversation, the reaction was usually a cold look or complete indifference. I never blamed Biscuit. I was proud of him. Still, being treated like an unnecessary accessory attached to the leash had hurt more than I liked admitting. Rinka had looked directly at me. She had talked to me. She had seemed genuinely interested in what I said. That alone was enough to make my hopeless brain start planning an entire marriage. I had just decided that today I would stop being a coward and try to have a real conversation with her when a familiar weight dropped onto my chest. Biscuit had jumped on me. The air shot out of my lungs as I opened my eyes and found him staring down at me. For 4 years, this had been his preferred method of informing me that sleeping time was over and breakfast time had begun. If I ignored the body slam, the next stage was scratching at my face, so I had been properly trained not to resist. I told him, right away, Mr. Hero, pushed him off, and headed downstairs. He followed in tight circles, becoming more animated the closer we got to the kitchen. I found a bowl and started filling it with some of the food the villagers had left for us. Then I hesitated. Half of it looked unfamiliar. Back home, I knew exactly what was safe for a dog. Here, I could not tell whether something that looked like harmless fruit might poison him. The instant that worry crossed my mind, an information window appeared. The foods inside the bowl were listed one by one. Each had a description comparing it to something from my world. And every entry ended with an enormous safe or not safe. Every explanation was signed with the same little a. The goddess really did love Biscuit. I sorted his breakfast according to divine nutritional guidance, then searched the rest of the system for anything remotely resembling an inventory. Nothing. No item box. No storage menu. No convenience skill for the summoned human. Once again, I had apparently received absolutely nothing. After Biscuit inhaled his meal in roughly half a second, I changed into some of the clothes the villagers had given me and prepared for our morning walk. Things became strange before we had even crossed the garden. Biscuit crouched and began his usual awkward walking poop. Yes, he walks while doing it. No, I cannot explain why. He is simply a weird dog. Only this time, when he finished and kicked dirt backward, there was no normal mess on the ground. There was a small brown box. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then, because I am both a responsible dog owner and an idiot in a fantasy world, I picked up the poop box. A system prompt asked whether I wanted to open the item box. Of course I said yes. And inside was a Nalmor antler. The name immediately caught my attention. The monster Biscuit had killed in the forest had looked like a giant moose-like beast, but I had never learned what it was called. I hooked the antler onto my shorts and decided Rinka could explain it later. While we walked toward the village center, I reopened Biscuit's status. He had gained 2 skill points from the previous night's battle. That felt strangely low for something large enough to throw me around like a toy, but without any reference point I could not judge it. His visible stats had not changed either. I started browsing his skill tree for anything costing 2 points. Before I could settle on a choice, shouting reached us from the village center. The center of the village was packed with people. It looked like almost every resident had gathered, and the mood was nothing like the celebration from the night before. The moment someone noticed us, a voice cut through the noise. "That's him! The fake hero!" My stomach dropped. The same man who had poured my drinks shouted that I was a liar. The craftsman who had made my new boots called me a thief. And the woman who had offered me her daughter accused me of sacrilege. Apparently, hospitality had an expiration date of about 8 hours. Rinka forced her way through the crowd before the shouting could get any worse. She immediately defended me, insisting she had seen me defeat the monster in the woods. Only now, while the villagers argued back, I finally learned that the creature they believed I had killed was called a dravhorn. That confused me. The item in my possession was labeled Nalmor Antler. The crowd itself was divided. Some remembered that the dravhorn was gone. Others pointed out that I undeniably had a Vera partner. A few argued that someone strong enough to command a Vera had to be incredibly high level. For several desperate seconds, I thought the lie might survive. One villager finally stepped forward and pointed directly at Biscuit. He had also seen the battle. According to him, I had not defeated the dravhorn at all. The Vera had done everything. Biscuit flinched at the accusing finger and moved behind me, pulling against the leash. That simple reaction made everything worse. Someone shouted that I was chaining my Vera like a slave. I understood at once how it looked in a culture where Veras were treated with religious reverence. Rinka kept pleading on my behalf, but another familiar person entered the crowd. The healer from the previous night, thankfully wearing far more clothing. She told me quietly that I should leave. Rinka protested, but the healer explained that the village was afraid. Nobody knew who I was. Nobody knew what kind of Vera Biscuit truly was. A creature powerful enough to save the village could just as easily destroy it, and the villagers were not willing to accept that risk. Rinka looked devastated. Seeing her expression hurt more than being insulted by the crowd. I had been enjoying their mistaken admiration, but she was the one paying emotionally for it. My old Hoshiman reflexes took over. I stepped forward and bowed deeply. I apologized for the unrest we had caused, thanked them for their hospitality, and promised that Biscuit and I would leave. I turned away before my embarrassment could get any worse. Biscuit, completely unaware that our luxurious fantasy life had just ended, still tried to stop and sniff buildings on the way out. I was homeless, unemployed, level 1, and lost in another world on my second day. My grand dream of living like a pampered hero had lasted less than 24 hours. At least I knew how to work. I had done enough odd jobs in my old life that finding some kind of employment seemed like the only realistic plan. I was still trying to decide where to go when footsteps hurried up behind me. Rinka called, "Mr. Hero, wait." I turned so quickly I almost tripped. She apologized for the villagers and explained that the community had always been suspicious of anything unfamiliar. She was frustrated with them, but too kind to insult anyone properly, so her complaint collapsed halfway through. I told her I did not blame her. I only asked one final favor. A map. That made her worry about where I intended to go. I admitted that I did not know yet somewhere bigger, probably where I could find work. She blinked at me and asked why. I was not simply working as an adventurer. I answered carefully that I was not formally registered. Rinka walked beside us in silence for a while, thinking. After a while, she stopped with such certainty in her face that I knew the decision had already been made. "I'll take you to the grand city Valdora." That declaration created a whole new problem. I had known her for less than a day. She lived here. She had responsibilities. And, for reasons that were absolutely practical and not personal research, I finally asked her age. Rinka proudly informed me that she was 20. Internally, I celebrated far too loudly. She also explained that her parents had been gone for years. She loved the village, but she was bored with her life there. Finding me in the woods and witnessing that battle had been the most exciting thing that had happened to her in years, and she wanted to see more of the world. I tried to be responsible and pointed out that she barely knew me. I also asked whether she had any combat skills. She admitted that she did not. All of her skills were related to housekeeping. Then, completely casually, she added, "I'd make the perfect housewife." My brain stopped functioning. Rinka realized what she had said, turned bright red, and immediately changed the subject. She ordered me to wait while she packed and ran back into the village before I could argue. While Biscuit and I waited beneath a large tree, I removed the harness and leash that had caused so much trouble. Biscuit shook himself with the relief of someone taking off uncomfortable clothes after a long day. I held the goddess's charm in my hand and wondered whether I still needed some visible proof that he was supposedly a Vera. That assumption had protected us as much as it had created problems. A system notification appeared the moment I thought about it. New item get. A golden collar materialized in my hand as the harness and leash vanished. The same strange emblem hung from it, which told me the goddess was clearly determined to keep Biscuit branded. I slipped the collar around his neck, flipped him onto his back, and held him like a baby. For a few quiet minutes, the fantasy world disappeared. It felt like being home again, sitting with him after a miserable shift, while anime played in the background. Those small moments had carried me through years of an otherwise dull life. I found myself wondering whether we would ever have that kind of peace again. Before long, both of us fell asleep under the tree. By the time I woke, the sun had shifted and left half my body exposed. I had acquired a fresh sunburn while Biscuit, traitor that he was, had moved with the shade and was still snoring comfortably in the grass. Rinka's voice came from the village road. I looked up and saw her walking toward us beneath a backpack that was easily twice the size of her body. She dropped it with a metallic clank, waking Biscuit so suddenly that he produced a tiny offended boof. After some argument about what she had packed and what we actually needed, I took the rucksack. Rinka mentioned that larger cities sometimes sold item bags, magical storage tools that could solve this exact problem, but neither of us had the money for such a luxury. True inventory skills, Rinka explained, were rare, even among high-level people. That only strengthened my suspicion that Biscuit had one. After all, he was literally producing item boxes from his rear. We started walking, but 10 minutes outside the village, Biscuit decided that walking was no longer part of his personal adventure and demanded transport. I ended up carrying both the giant backpack and my spoiled dog while Rinka walked beside me. Strangely, talking to her was easy. We discussed towns, job classes, money, skills, and all kinds of basic knowledge that everyone in this world should have known. Rinka found my ignorance amusing. Whenever a question became too dangerous, I used the oldest Isekai excuse available to me. I came from a very distant land where things worked differently. Eventually, I asked about the name on the antler. The moment I said the word Nalmor, Rinka stopped walking. The change in her expression was immediate. She explained that Nalmor were among the worst monsters anyone could encounter because a person might meet one without ever realizing it. They were shapeshifters. Nobody knew their original form, and they could imitate almost anything, including people. The stories surrounding them were old and ugly. Entire communities had torn themselves apart through paranoia, unable to know whether friends and neighbors were real. Sometimes a Nalmor copying another monster would use abilities the original species should not possess. Sometimes the only proof came after death. When the creature dropped an item bearing the Nalmor name, I touched the antler hanging from my shorts. Rinka's voice grew quieter as she explained the most disturbing part. No matter how dangerous the shape they copied, Nalmor themselves were classified as common monsters. Something about the way she said it made me think this was not just folklore to her. There was personal history buried behind those words. I wanted to ask, but her face told me not to. I changed the subject, but the mood never fully recovered. By evening, we decided to camp. One of my old part-time jobs had been camp counseling, so at least the useless patchwork of my previous employment finally had a practical benefit. I managed to build a fire and make a simple meal from bread and cheese. Toasting the bread and melting the cheese over it impressed Rinka far more than it should have. Biscuit, meanwhile, somehow produced another smoked ham-looking piece of food. At that point, I was almost certain he had storage access I could not see. Of course, he was using it mainly to hoard snacks. We cleared stones from the ground and prepared to sleep under thin blankets. The dirt was not unbearable. I had lived in bad enough apartments to adapt. Still, I missed that absurdly soft pillow from the village more than I expected. I watched the back of Rinka's pink curls as she settled down and found myself thinking less about Nalmor and more about how little I actually knew about her. Once again, I fell asleep with her on my mind. Once again, disaster arrived before morning properly began. A scream ripped me awake. Birds exploded from the nearby trees as I scrambled upright and somehow convinced myself I had taken a proper fighting stance. In reality, I was half crouched with my fists wobbling in front of my face like an amateur boxer who had never been punched. I expected a monster. Instead, I found Rinka pressed against a tree, clutching her dress, while Biscuit crouched in front of her with his chest low, his rear in the air, and his tail wagging furiously. He wanted to play. Rinka thought she was being threatened by a divine beast. I almost laughed from relief. This was actually the first time Biscuit had behaved completely like his old self since arriving. At the shelter, he had once been terrified of every unfamiliar sound, smell, and person. Over the years, he had become shamelessly social. It seemed he had simply needed a few days to stop treating this new world as one giant threat. I tried to explain that he was only playing, but Rinka had already dropped to her hands and knees and started apologizing to the great Vera for whatever offense she had committed. Her eyes were wet with panic. She told me Biscuit had jumped on her while she slept and scratched her face when she refused to move. I knew that behavior perfectly. He had simply been demanding breakfast and attention. Rinka did not. When Biscuit barked again, she yelped and ran to the other side of the camp. Naturally, that convinced him the game had officially started. He chased her in excited circles, while Rinka continued begging his forgiveness. I tried to stop both of them, failed, and in a moment of pure frustration shouted the truth. "He's just a dog." The words left my mouth before I could stop them. I froze, and Rinka slowed to a halt. For one terrifying second, I thought I had destroyed everything. Instead, she stared at me in total confusion and asked, "What is a dog?" Of course, dogs did not exist here. The crisis would have continued if Biscuit had not suddenly stopped. His ears lifted toward a bush. Rinka immediately hid behind me. A small creature hopped into view. It resembled a rabbit with pointed horns and bat-like wings. Rinka recognized it as a velha, and almost instantly recovered enough to start talking about the stew she could make from it. Food, apparently, did wonders for her emotional state. My own panic went in the opposite direction. If the velha attacked, how was I supposed to fight without exposing the truth? I had no weapon, no skill, and no idea whether waving my Nalmor antler around like a club would make me look more or less suspicious. While I stood there, overthinking every possible lie, Biscuit calmly approached the velha. He did not attack it. He sniffed it the same cautious way he would have investigated a strange dog back home. The velha tolerated him for only a moment. Once he got too close, it screamed and lunged. I grabbed the antler and raised it. Before I could swing, the velha dropped to the ground. Its rear half hissed and dissolved, the body broke into pixels, and Biscuit stood there licking his lips while a faint pink light flashed over him. Rinka went silent before saying exactly what I feared. That was the same attack that had killed the Dravhorn, and I had not been the one to use it. Biscuit had. I could not bring myself to look at her. Even then, I tried one last pathetic lie. I claimed my Vera partner handled small monsters for me. Rinka's silence hurt more than shouting would have. When she finally spoke, her voice started low and became angrier with every word. Veras, she explained, did not possess independent combat skills. They copied the abilities their contracted partner had already used in battle. That was why Vera users were so feared. The same skill could effectively be produced twice. A Vera was not supposed to have a unique attack its master could not perform. Rinka understood everything at once. The villagers had been right. and I really was a liar. When I tried to explain, she cut me off with 4 words that landed harder than any monster attack. "You're not a hero." Tears streamed down her face. She shoved past me and ran into the woods. Biscuit watched her disappear, cocked his head, and then sprinted after her, because he apparently believed the earlier game of chase had resumed. The universe could not have given me a dog with better timing. I stood there for half a second, disgusted with myself. I had gone along with the lie, because people finally respected me, because Rinka looked at me differently, because pretending to be special felt good after a lifetime of being ordinary, and now the person I cared about most in this world was running away because I had been too cowardly to tell her the truth. I dropped our bag and ran after them. The forest was thick enough that branches cut my face and hands as I forced my way through. I lost sight of both Rinka and Biscuit almost immediately. I just kept moving toward whatever noise I could hear, until barking finally reached me from deeper in the trees. I called Biscuit's name and pushed through the brush until I finally found them. Rinka was crouched on the ground, covering her head, while Biscuit stood between her and roughly 24 Velha. He growled whenever one moved closer. The creatures surrounded them in several small groups, filling the clearing with sharp squeaks. That sound triggered a very specific memory. Biscuit has no prey drive. Birds, squirrels, cats, none of them ever interested him much. But squeaky toys? Squeaky toys turned him into a murderer. I had spent thousands of yen replacing plush animals, balls, and anything else containing a squeaker. Biscuit did not know many words, but he absolutely knew one command. So I shouted, "Biscuit, get your squeaky!" I prayed. The Velhair sounded enough like his toys for the idea to work. It worked immediately. Biscuit launched himself at the nearest Velhair, bit down, and shook it violently. He moved through the group with terrifying enthusiasm, treating each monster like a toy he had been personally challenged to destroy. I had never been so grateful that my dog was an idiot. Yet something strange became obvious as the fight continued. Biscuit kept leaving a few Velha untouched. Every one of them had stopped moving. For one absurd moment I wondered whether his vision worked like a movie dinosaur. Could he only see them when they moved? There was no time to figure it out. One Velha broke away from the group and charged Rinka. I stepped between them. The creature's horn drove into my stomach. Pain exploded through me so violently that my knees nearly gave out. I grabbed the Nalmor antler and hammered at the Velha, but my strength barely mattered. I was still level 1, still useless in a fight, still exactly the person I had been pretending not to be. A crack like thunder suddenly tore through the clearing. The pressure hit hard enough to throw me backward. Every remaining Velhair shrieked and vanished into pixels. As blood soaked my clothes, and my vision narrowed, one final thought drifted through my head. So that was Sonic Bark. Then, everything went black. When I woke, Biscuit was licking my face. A soft green glow surrounded his tongue. I felt weak, but the terrible pain in my stomach was gone. His status window appeared, and beneath his other abilities was a new skill, Heal, costing 12 SP. That immediately confused me. He had only possessed 2 points before the fight. There had been more than 20 Velhare, but if ordinary Velhare were low-level monsters, the numbers still did not make much sense. I was trying to do arithmetic through a foggy brain when I noticed Rinka sitting beside me, crying quietly. She apologized and told me I had put myself in danger to protect her even after what she had said. My romantic idiot brain prepared to forgive her for everything before she finished the sentence. She finished by pointing out that I had done it despite being a weakling with no skills. Some wounds heal could not fix. I laughed anyway. The punctures in my stomach were completely gone. Biscuit pawed at me with obvious concern, so I ruffled his fur until he relaxed. I finally did something I should have done the day before and told Rinka my name. "I'm Mitsuaki. You don't have to call me Mr. Hero anymore. And he's Biscuit." She repeated the names, hesitated over mine, and immediately connected it with honey. I groaned, which only made her laugh harder. When I protested that it was not that funny, she pointed to herself and informed me that Rinka meant pear blossom. That broke the tension completely. We laughed together until even Biscuit started dancing on his feet, convinced something exciting was happening. When Biscuit put his paws on Rinka's lap, She stiffened and looked at me for help. That was when I decided there would be no more lies. I told her everything. What my world was like. What dogs and pets were. How Biscuit and I had met. How the truck had appeared. How the goddess had summoned us. And how every level, skill, and heroic blessing intended for me had somehow gone to him instead. Rinka listened until the fear gradually left her face. By the end, she was running her fingers through Biscuit's fur while he enthusiastically licked her hands and face. Exactly as expected, nobody survives his charm for long. What surprised me was what came next. Even after learning that I was not a hero, Rinka still wanted to travel with us. I warned her that I probably could not even register as an adventurer. If excitement was what she wanted, a level 1 man with no skills might be the worst possible guide. Rinka admitted she had other reasons for leaving the village too, then said she was certain we could find something exciting together. I was not emotionally equipped for the way that last word landed. We found our abandoned bag, made our way back to the road, and continued toward Great City Valdora. The trip took 2 more days. During that time, Rinka and Biscuit became inseparable. She hugged him, carried him, talked to him, and smothered him with affection with none of the embarrassment I had always felt doing the same thing in public. I became jealous in 2 completely different directions. Jealous because I wanted Rinka to pay that much attention to me, and jealous because I also wanted to bury my face in Biscuit's ridiculous fur. By the time the walls of Valdora finally came into view, we had another practical problem to solve. Rinka thought we should still let everyone believe Biscuit was a Vera partner. That part made sense. The goddess's emblem gave us a convenient explanation for his strength and strange abilities. The issue was behavior. Without a leash, Biscuit wandered toward every interesting smell. He tired quickly and expected to be carried. None of that matched the image of an obedient legendary Vera following its master. Our solution was embarrassing, but functional. We would reach an inn as quickly as possible, and Rinka would physically intercept Biscuit whenever he tried to wander. Every so often, she would make a squeaking noise to lure him back. For reasons I still cannot explain, Rinka could imitate a squeaky toy, almost perfectly. I found that adorable too. We entered Valdora under curious stares. Veras were rare enough to draw attention. And I imagined the sight of Rinka moving erratically around a tiny golden-collared Pomeranian while squeaking at him did not help. We made it to an inexpensive inn without disaster, and rented the cheapest room available. The first problem revealed itself the moment we opened the door. There was only 1 bed. Rinka and I looked at each other and turned red at the same time. Biscuit ran past us, jumped onto the mattress, and spun happily in circles, because once again, he was the only member of the group immune to social tension. I promised Rinka at once that I would sleep on the floor. She nodded so hard I worried about her neck. We had barely started discussing how we might earn money when Biscuit jumped off the bed and began circling the room. At first I thought he was restless. Then he started searching corners, pausing, turning, and looking increasingly uncomfortable. I called to him, but he only squatted. 1 item box appeared, followed by another, then another, until a growing mound of brown boxes covered the floor before I could process what I was seeing. Rinka was somewhere between horrified and fascinated. I expected Biscuit to finish with his usual dirt-kicking ritual. Instead, he wheezed and collapsed onto his side. Every joke vanished from my head. I grabbed him immediately. His body was burning hot. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Rinka touched his head and jerked her hand back in alarm. When she asked whether this was normal for dogs, I told her no, and panic swallowed me almost immediately. This world had no dogs, no veterinarians, no medicine I recognized. I had spent years protecting Biscuit from food he should not eat, hot pavement, traffic, sickness, and every ridiculous danger a tiny animal could find. Here, I did not even know who to ask for help. For a few seconds, I could imagine only the possibility of losing him. Rinka grabbed my shoulders and forced me back into the present. She reminded me that the church dealt with Veras and employed healers. Whatever Biscuit truly was, that was still our best chance. I ran after her through the streets with Biscuit held against my chest, feeling his breath struggle against me. We burst into the church and begged for help. Several healers gathered around us, but their expressions changed the moment they saw Biscuit. They whispered that they had never seen a Vera like him. Some wondered whether Veras could even become sick. Others simply refused to approach. Rinka demanded to know why nobody would heal him. A man in white robes with a gold scarf gave us the answer. They were afraid. In this world, Veras were believed to be reincarnations or contracted forms of god-tier monsters. If their healing failed and the Vera became angry, the entire city might suffer. Rinka pleaded with them, and so did I, but it made no difference. The healers turned away. I walked out of the church, repeating the same words to myself. Healer! I need a healer! My vision blurred. I looked down at Biscuit and hated how helpless I was. He had been my only constant companion for years, and now when he needed me most, I did not know how to save him. Then a meek voice called after us. Wait! A tall, slender woman ran from the churchyard. She had muted flax-colored hair, a healer's white robe beneath a green outer garment, long rounded animal ears on top of her head, and a thin tail trailing behind her. Before I could stop her, she gently took Biscuit from my arms and laid him on the ground. I panicked and begged her not to hurt him. She ignored me and began chanting in a language I could not understand. Green light gathered around Biscuit. There was nothing useful I could do. So I dropped to my hands and knees, pressed my forehead into the dirt, and prayed to every god I had ever heard of. I prayed to the gods of Hoshima. I prayed to the ridiculous goddess who had dragged us here. I prayed to anyone who might listen. The healer worked until sweat covered her face, and the next few minutes felt like hours. At last, the green light faded, and Biscuit started snoring. The woman smiled and told me he would be okay. I grabbed him so quickly, I smeared dirt from my face all over his fur. I kissed his head again and again while he slept through the entire emotional reunion. Rinka spoke with the healer while I recovered. Then the same man from the church stormed outside. He demanded to know what the woman had done. She tried to apologize and explain that Biscuit needed help, but he cut her off. He called her impudent, accused her of repeatedly bringing trouble to the church, and finally ordered her to leave. His last words were the cruelest. He called her a cursed child and walked away. The woman stood there in devastated silence until Rinka reached over and took her hand. And because apparently collecting outcasts had become our new class skill, we brought her back to the inn with us. Back in the room, Biscuit slept peacefully on the bed, while the three of us sat around a small table. I left the pile of item boxes untouched for the moment. Whatever mystery they contained could wait until I knew my dog was truly safe. Rinka brought up tea from downstairs, and the animal-eared healer finally introduced herself. Her full name was Solara Vane. I tried repeating it silently, and failed so visibly that she kindly told me Sailor was fine. Sailor explained that her people came from a land of mountains and vast deserts northwest of the kingdom, across the sea. Animal-featured people were far more common there. Here in Valdora, she had spent years trying to gain acceptance while training as a healer. She was talented. That much was obvious after what she had just done for Biscuit. Her problem was that she believed healing should not depend on whether the patient was human. Sella had spent years treating farm animals and researching how healing magic affected non-human bodies. Eventually, she developed a spell adapted from animal healing incantations that could work on monsters. The church hated the idea. Recently, she had healed a wounded Scorvale, a scorpion-like monster with a false human face on its tail. After recovering, the creature destroyed one of the church's temporary sheds. That incident had apparently been the last straw. Sailor still refused to abandon her belief. Not all monsters are evil, she explained. She wanted to help anyone who came to her, no matter their shape or species. After what she had done for Biscuit, I was ready to build her a shrine. I asked whether she knew what had happened to him. Sailor could not give a perfect diagnosis, but she had noticed two things. Biscuit was completely exhausted, and his MP had been drained to nothing. Her first assumption was that I had pushed him through too many battles. That accusation hit hard even before Rinka reminded her that Biscuit had not fought anything for 2 days. Sella reconsidered. She theorized that a Vera might require an unusually long recovery after completely depleting its MP. Part of the spell she had used came from a technique she normally cast on large animals after giving birth, because both conditions involved severe physical exhaustion. Then she asked something that made my stomach tighten. Could I use heal too? I told her I could not. She explained that inexperienced healers sometimes suffered recoil when treating someone they cared about. They unconsciously took a portion of the patient's pain or exhaustion into themselves. Heal was especially demanding. Even high-level people could burn through enormous amounts of MP if they used it repeatedly. That explanation finally made everything click. After the Velha had stabbed me, Biscuit had somehow purchased heal and used it to save me. But he had not stopped there. He had probably been healing every small cut and scratch I received afterward, because he did not understand the difference between a life-threatening wound and this minor injury. Then, instead of letting him rest, Rinka and I had rushed toward Valdora because we were excited. The guilt was immediate and brutal. I had been so focused on the fact that Biscuit was level 99 that I had forgotten he was still Biscuit. He could not read an MP bar. He did not understand resource management. He only knew I was hurt, and he wanted to fix it. I promised him silently that I would never let that happen again. Rinka noticed how badly I was taking it. Sailor did too. Rather than press the issue, Sailor changed the subject and admitted she had no idea what she would do now that the church had expelled her. That created an uncomfortable silence because, technically, none of us knew what we were doing. A thought finally came to me: marketable skills. The women stared at me while I tried to explain. I explained that in my old life, people could survive by finding something they were good at and turning it into work. Rinka pointed out that the three of us had completely different abilities, so no single employer was likely to want all of us. Sella added that the church had publicly disgraced her, which could make normal employment difficult, even if someone needed a healer. I leaned back in my chair while searching through years of odd job memories for an answer. One leg snapped, the chair collapsed beneath me, and I hit the floor. Somehow, that humiliating moment gave me the best idea I had possessed since entering this world. Still lying on my back, I told Rinka and Sella to search Valdora for the cheapest storefront they could find. It did not need to be large or attractive, it only needed to be cheap. Rinka immediately reminded me that we had no money. I told her that was fine. First, we needed to know the price. I would figure out the rest. The two women left with the deeply uncertain expressions of people humoring a man who had just been defeated by furniture. Once they were gone, I turned my attention to the pile of item boxes. Biscuit was still sleeping, so I opened them one by one instead of disturbing him. Most contained exactly what I expected from the Velhair attack: meat, horns, and wings. But several items carried the Nhalmor label 3 horns and 2 wings, and the numbers did not match the battle. Biscuit had intentionally left 4 Velha untouched before Sonic Bark wiped out everything in range. If those 4 had been Nhalmor, there should have been 4 suspicious drops. Instead, there were 5, which meant the Velhair that had attacked Rinka before the swarm appeared, the one Biscuit killed with acid shot, had also been a Nhalmor. I thought back to both encounters. Biscuit had not attacked the Nhalmor Dravhorn immediately. He reacted only when it threatened us. He had also approached the Nhalmor Velhair peacefully until it lunged. During the larger fight, he instinctively ignored the disguised Nhalmor whenever they stayed still. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss. Biscuit could tell Nhalmor apart from normal monsters. I did not know how or why, but that ability might become incredibly important. Next, I reopened his status and tried to understand the skill point math. The only explanation that fit was that Nhalmor awarded 2 SP each, regardless of the form they copied. Normal Velha were probably too weak to give anything at all. That would explain how Biscuit had reached enough points to purchase heal during the battle, which raised another question. Could Biscuit spend his own skill points? If so, had he chosen heal specifically because I was dying? I leaned over and kissed his head. His visible stats were still unchanged. HP had returned to full, probably thanks to Sailor. Strength, speed, defense, and MP appeared identical to before. Either weak monsters could not increase the stats of a level 99 hero, or Biscuit had already reached his limits. Then I noticed something new on the skill tree. Telepathy, costing 50 SP. I stared at the word for a long time. Could it really mean exactly what it sounded like? Could I eventually talk to Biscuit? Not interpret barking. Not guess what he wanted based on body language. Actually talk to the dog who had been my closest companion for years. The possibility nearly made me forget every other problem we had. I was still mentally celebrating when Rinka and Sailor returned near dusk. Biscuit had woken by then, and seemed almost completely normal. He kept huffing and making little aroo noises because I was not giving him enough attention, even though I had spent most of the afternoon playing with him, feeding him, rubbing his belly, and generally treating him like recovering royalty. Rinka immediately took his side and scolded me for neglecting the poor thing after his ordeal. Traitor! She cuddled him while Seela watched with a mixture of fascination and reverence. Seela still believed Biscuit was a divine Vera and politely refused when we encouraged her to pet him. In her mind, casually touching something like that simply was not proper. Eventually I asked what they had found. Their expressions became suspiciously uncomfortable. Everything near the city center was far beyond our budget. There was, however, one small storefront in the northern outskirts that was unusually cheap. Rinka could barely bring herself to explain why. The shop was directly beside a brothel, or, as I decided to call it for the sake of my remaining innocence, a dance club. Rinka buried her face in the bed, while Sela stared intensely at the wall. Biscuit pawed at Rinka's hair as though trying to rescue her from embarrassment. I assured them that if the price was low enough, I could overlook the neighbors. The location might only be temporary anyway. That led to the harder question. What exactly did I intend to do with a storefront? I announced the grand concept I had spent the afternoon refining. We would become part-timers. Rinka looked thoroughly unimpressed, so I tried again and explained that people would come to us with jobs, and we would do them. Rinka asked whether I meant an adventurers guild. Not exactly. So I gave her examples. If someone tore a dress, would they post an expensive guild request? Of course not. They would visit a seamstress. If a chair broke, they would find a woodworker. If someone needed healing, they would go to the church. Then I asked her to imagine one place where all those small services could be requested. Clothing, repairs, furniture fixes, healing, deliveries, gathering, cleaning, anything too minor or too strange for the guild to bother with. Rinka's immediate response was painfully logical. Why would people not simply visit the individual tradespeople? Trying to explain a tasking app business model in a world centuries away from smartphones was much harder than I expected. I insisted that the point was convenience and flexibility. We would do anything. Rinka asked why. I answered, because we're desperate. Then I gave her a finger gun gesture. She did not understand it. Instead, she copied the shape with her hand and touched her fingertip to mine. That tiny smile hit me harder than any monster attack so far. Sela, who had been listening quietly over tea, finally translated my terrible explanation into language this world actually understood. She said we would operate like adventurers who accepted the F-rank requests the guild considered too small, while combining multiple specialized talents in one convenient shop. Rinka immediately brightened and praised Sela for the splendid idea. It was my idea. She had simply converted it into RPG terminology. Still, I could not complain too much. Technically, I had stolen the concept from task service apps in my old world. If this world was 500 years away from smartphones, I was allowed to exploit my past life knowledge a little. Then we discussed the ugly part, money. The storefront cost 50 gold per month. That number meant nothing to me until I asked Rinka how much work it represented. She would need to mend roughly 200 garments just to cover 1 month's rent. Sailor calculated that, even if she charged only half the church's price, she would need around 100 minor healing jobs or about 15 major ones. Suddenly, 50 gold looked enormous. I needed more information before deciding whether my grand business plan was genius or just another way to become homeless. By then, Sailor was exhausted. She stood to return to the church, reached for the door, and froze. The church was no longer her home. So, our sleeping arrangements became even more crowded. I insisted that Rinka and Sela share the bed. I had already planned to sleep on the floor when it was only Rinka and me. Biscuit chose a pillow beside my improvised sleeping spot. Back home, his preferred location changed with the weather. In winter, he buried himself under the blankets against my stomach. In summer, he kept his distance and hunted for the coolest patch of floor. Whenever he felt sick, though, he always wanted to sleep beside me. That habit had occasionally resulted in waking beside dog vomit. I had accepted the price of emotional support years ago. We said goodnight and finally slept. The next morning, I woke with the sun and accepted that this world's lack of late-night internet was slowly turning me into a morning person. Today had two goals. First, investigate the guild and learn how people actually made money here. Second, start turning my business idea into something that could survive contact with reality. There was also a third goal that mattered even more. I needed to understand Biscuit's combat abilities without nearly killing him again. Rinka had told me the guild opened after breakfast, which was a wonderfully vague operating schedule. With time to spare, I woke Biscuit and took him outside the city for a light run. Routine had always been important to him. If this world was going to keep changing everything else, I at least wanted his days to feel familiar. We stopped in an open field where he could sniff and mark territory to his heart's content. Then, I began step 1 of my training plan: teach Biscuit to use a skill on command. Until our shop existed, I needed some way to contribute financially. Biscuit was absurdly strong, and I could not ignore that forever. I hated putting him near danger, but low-level monsters were clearly no threat to him. If I could direct his abilities reliably, we could collect materials without gambling with his safety. I opened his status to review the available skills: Acid Shot, Boost Jump, Barrier Breaker, Sonic Bark, and Heal. Of those, Acid Shot and Sonic Bark seemed like the only obvious attacks. His physical strength alone was already enough to make a headbutt terrifying. For our grand training arc, I had brought one fearsome weapon, a pillow from the inn. I placed it in the grass, stepped back, pointed dramatically, and ordered, "Biscuit, go!" Biscuit walked to the pillow. Then he sat on it and looked at me expectantly. That failure was entirely my fault. At home, I had used almost the same command to send him to his bed. I spent the next hour trying different words, gestures, tones, and increasingly desperate forms of encouragement. Biscuit responded by sitting, lying down, wandering off, asking for affection, and generally doing everything except attacking the pillow. By the time the sun had climbed well above the horizon, the pillow remained completely unharmed, while Biscuit expected treats for his hard work. I surrendered. Back at the inn, Rinka and Sailor were already drinking tea, a habit that seemed to be forming faster than our actual business. I asked Rinka to accompany me to a nearby shop where we could sell the Velha materials and clear the growing pile of monster products out of our room. Sailor stayed behind with Biscuit. Rinka insisted it would help the two of them get used to each other. My hopeless romantic brain preferred to think Rinka wanted a date. The shop itself looked like a childhood RPG fantasy. Arrows, basic weapons, bombs, tools, and monster materials filled the walls. The only things missing were a giant floating heart and an oversized nut-shaped flash item. We placed the ordinary Velha meat and materials on the counter and received 2 gold for the lot. Low-level monsters meant low-level profits, which was fair enough. The 3 Nalmor horns and 2 wings earned us 1 additional gold. The Nalmor label added some value, but a fake weak monster was still a weak monster. Finally, I put the large antler from our first battle on the counter. The shopkeeper's reaction changed immediately. He rarely saw Dravhorn parts at all, and he had never handled a Nalmor version. He asked us to return later so he could appraise it properly. We left with 3 gold and another lesson in this world's economy. 1 gold equaled 10 silver, which was easy enough. The problem was that 1 gold also equaled roughly 186 copper. Who designed that conversion? I was capable of doing the math. I simply refused to respect it. Rinka became our unofficial treasurer almost immediately. Our inn-room cost 5 silver per night. 3 gold would not carry us for long once food and other necessities were included. Which meant it was finally time to visit the institution every isekai protagonist eventually reaches, the Adventurers Guild. From outside, the building looked more like a courthouse than a tavern. Wide entrance, imposing columns, and enough rough-looking people loitering on the steps to make me instinctively check for my wallet. Inside, it resembled a bank. A long counter stood behind protective bars. Clerks worked from the other side, and tables occupied one portion of the room. And there, exactly where it belonged, was the job board. I hurried over like a student checking exam results. First, I wanted to see whether the guild handled the kind of small miscellaneous work I planned to build our business around. It did not. Almost every posting was directly tied to adventuring, monster hunting, gathering in dangerous areas, escort work, exploration, and other jobs large enough to justify guild fees. The closest overlap was bulk material collection. That was good news for my future shop. Next, I searched for easy combat requests with decent rewards. I wanted something safe enough for Biscuit to practice without repeating the disaster that had drained his MP. Rinka kept reminding me that his stats were absurdly high, but my brain still saw the same fluffy animal who had once been defeated by a vacuum cleaner. A few low-level requests looked promising. Then I asked the receptionist the important question: could I accept them without registering? No. Could I register as a level 1 man with no job and no skills? Also no. Apparently I had discovered a new world just to remain unemployable. I dragged myself to one of the tables and prepared to enjoy my favorite hobby, self-pity, while Rinka continued speaking with the receptionist. Less than a minute later, Rinka came running over. There was a loophole. I could register if I joined a party with Rinka and Sailor. I jumped up, grabbed Rinka, and swung her around in celebration before remembering I was supposed to behave like a normal adult around the woman I liked. Rinka laughed instead of hitting me, which made the mistake feel completely worthwhile. She explained why the rule worked. Rinka was level 15, Sailor was level 40, and together, their levels were enough to sponsor me. I slowly put Rinka down, returned to the table, and covered my face. Even my permission to become an adventurer depended on 2 women carrying my useless level 1 self. Wonderful. Later that day, Sailor joined us for a second trip into town. Biscuit stayed in the room despite his complaints. The innkeeper had never heard a dog bark before and looked ready to panic. So we casually explained that our Veira partner was angry. The man immediately decided not to ask further questions. Our first stop was the item shop. The appraiser offered 5 gold for the Nalmor antler. I had hoped for more, but his reasoning was fair. He did not know whether a shapeshifter's copied body part functioned the same way as a true Dravhorn antler. Then, he accidentally revealed that an authentic antler from the boss-tier monster would be worth about 50 gold. For several seconds, I mourned the wealth we had technically seen and failed to obtain. In the end, I kept the Nalmor antler anyway. It was the first item from our first battle, and in a strange way, it was connected to the day I met Rinka. 5 gold was not enough to sell that memory. Before we left, the shopkeeper gave us a warning. Nalmor had apparently been imitating stronger and stronger boss monsters lately. He did not know why. Even surviving an imitation of a Dravhorn was something he considered unusual. Rinka and I exchanged a worried look. The Nalmor mystery was getting larger, not smaller. At the guild, Sailor officially became our party leader. Her level allowed us to accept requests up to rank D. We might have qualified for more if our group included a proper attacker, but the receptionist already looked confused by the combination of a disgraced healer, a housekeeping specialist, a level 1 nobody, and an alleged Veira. Honestly, rank D was generous. With registration complete, we began assembling the money for our future storefront in whatever ways we could. Sailor stationed herself near the city gate in the evenings and offered discounted healing to adventurers returning without a healer in their party. The church charged far more, so business came quickly. More than one group tried to recruit her permanently. Fortunately for us, Sailor had little interest in adventuring itself. She cared about healing and improving her spells. Rinka developed her own market. She visited construction sites and workshops, watching for laborers who had torn clothes during work. Instead of waiting for them to visit a seamstress or take damaged clothing home, she repaired garments immediately for a small fee. Between her skill and her smile, she did extremely well. One day, she returned having earned more than Sailor and was almost glowing with pride. My contribution was less elegant. I took Biscuit on low-level monster requests. The first request attracted me for one reason only. It mentioned gremlins. At last, I thought, a proper fantasy classic. Then I saw the creature, and it was basically a pig walking upright. That isn't Tuskborn. I do not care what this world's taxonomy says. You cannot steal an Tuskborn, call it a gremlin, and expect a lifelong nerd to accept the decision peacefully. Still, a request was a request. I pointed dramatically and shouted, "Go, Biscuit!" For once, the command worked. Biscuit charged forward and headbutted the so-called gremlin, which vanished into pixels in one hit. I checked his status immediately, but there was no meaningful change. We fought several more, and at one point a gremlin managed to strike Biscuit. I nearly had a heart attack until I saw the result. He had lost 1 HP out of 3,000. That was the moment I finally accepted that low-level monsters posed less danger to Biscuit than furniture probably posed to me. Most beginner guild requests required proof of a certain number of kills, usually through dropped materials. The guild kept part of the loot and paid a small bonus. At our level of work, that usually meant only a few silver per request. It was not impressive money, and Biscuit's item box schedule made everything more awkward. I could not simply collect drops from the battlefield. I had to wait for my dog to process them through whatever bizarre inventory system the goddess had given him. Sometimes he seemed to hold on to certain items deliberately, especially the gremlin meat that looked suspiciously like the smoked ham he loved eating. After a few weeks, we had moved up to level 15 monsters such as Scorvale. Biscuit handled them easily. I had mostly stopped panicking whenever something approached him, though I still watched his HP and MP obsessively. He rarely needed skills. Physical attacks were enough. That meant his SP accumulated steadily. Eventually, he reached 38 points. Telepathy cost 50. For the first time, I could see that dream coming within reach. I also continued testing my Nhalmor theory whenever we encountered one. The pattern held. Biscuit seemed able to identify shapeshifters before anyone else could, but he often refused to attack them until they threatened either him or me. I developed several explanations and proved none of them. Maybe he sensed intent. Maybe Nhalmor smelled different. Maybe the goddess had given him a hidden detection ability. For now, all I could do was keep watching. Money improved faster than answers did. We paid for the inn, bought food, replaced necessities, and still managed to save. I even allowed myself one irresponsible purchase for Biscuit. Rinka and I found a toy shop and bought him a small stuffed Velhair and a colorful ball. Sadly, the world had not invented squeakers. Biscuit loved the toy anyway. He destroyed the stuffed Velhair in one evening. Luckily, Rinka's repair skills meant it could be restored indefinitely. After enough cycles of destruction and resurrection, Biscuit started sleeping with the thing. Sailor slowly became more comfortable around him too. She still believed he was a Vera, and remained tense whenever he suddenly touched her or barked, but she had started copying his little awa awa and aru noises back at him. It was one of the strangest friendships I had ever watched form. 3 days later, we finally reached the number that had seemed impossible only a few weeks earlier, 50 gold. Our startup fund sat in a bag on the table. We were ready to rent the shop. For all the planning we had done, I had never actually seen the storefront myself. Rinka had visited it with Sela, and every time the subject came up, she radiated the kind of despair usually reserved for tax notices and funerals. The space was still available though, and our current inn had begun asking too many questions about Biscuit. Moving made sense even without the business. So we packed everything we owned into one enormous backpack, said goodbye to the room that had been our home for the last month, and headed north through great city Valdora. The city was large enough that crossing districts took more than an hour. The farther north we walked, the older everything became. Streets narrowed. Buildings showed cracks and weathering. A few structures stood empty or partially collapsed. It was not quite a slum, but back in my world, someone absolutely would have renamed it a historical district and charged tourists extra for the atmosphere. I tried to imagine our little shop becoming the first step in revitalizing the neighborhood. It was a nice fantasy. Rinka, meanwhile, slowed with every block. Biscuit kept moving ahead, then stopping to look back at her, because even he could tell something was wrong. When I asked whether she was okay, she stared straight ahead and insisted the neighborhood was very pretty. It was one of the least convincing lies I had ever heard. Then Sela casually said, "Don't worry, Rinka. Sir Mitsuaki only has eyes for you." Rinka stopped walking, and I stopped breathing. We both turned bright red and produced an incoherent noise at exactly the same time. Biscuit jumped around us, delighted that everyone suddenly seemed excited. Nobody spoke properly for the rest of the walk. By the time we reached the storefront, evening had settled over the district and our neighboring business had begun opening for the night. Calling it a dance club had always been my strategy for emotional self-defense. Seeing it in person made that strategy difficult. Women in revealing outfits leaned from open windows. Pink and red curtains moved in the evening breeze. Lantern lights spilled into the road through smoke and the smell of alcohol. The entire building seemed designed to invite poor decision-making. Rinka stared at the ground. Sela found several fascinating things to look at in the opposite direction. I behaved with perfect dignity. Probably. We had agreed to meet the landlord outside the empty storefront. After a short wait, a woman emerged from the neighboring establishment. She was impossible to ignore. Tall even compared with Sela, broad and powerfully built, she wore a tight dress that seemed engaged in an ongoing negotiation with physics. Long, luxurious hair fell behind her, jewels covered her arms and neck, and her jaw looked carved from stone. Every movement made something jingle. Her voice was just as large as the rest of her personality. She greeted us as her sweeties and immediately joked about whether we planned anything nefarious beside her girls. Before anyone could answer, she decided we looked too young, innocent, and bewildered to be dangerous. Then she announced that she had to inspect her new tenants because she was an excellent judge of character, and she began with me. Her hands closed around my shoulders and I suddenly understood how Biscuit must feel when strangers pick him up without warning. The woman praised my hair, my eyes, and my supposed world-weary wisdom with such confidence that I actually started believing her. She called me handsome and asked where Valdora had been hiding me. She even suggested I would be popular with her girls. After a lifetime of women treating me as the invisible man attached to a cute dog's leash, I was not emotionally prepared for concentrated flattery delivered at that volume. I was still blushing when she moved on to Sela. The landlord called her a desert rose, praised her tall body, ears, and tail, and suggested that her quiet personality hid a beauty waiting to bloom. Sela shrank inward so quickly I thought she might physically disappear. Her ears turned bright pink. Rinka was next. The landlord called her a simple garden flower and immediately clarified that simple did not mean plain. Some flowers, she said, only reach their full beauty when loved and cared for by someone else. Then she declared that Rinka was obviously in love, and my heart stopped. She teased that perhaps Rinka had fallen in love with her after only one meeting. Rinka stared in horror until the woman burst into enormous laughter and admitted she was joking. I laughed too, though a little later than I should have. Her tone softened after that. She told Rinka she was a sweet, confident young woman who would come into her own with time. Rinka's smile returned. She gave the landlord the same small curtsy she had given me the night we met. That movement exposed Biscuit, who had been hiding behind her skirt. For the first time since meeting her, the landlord became silent. She knelt slowly and held out one massive hand. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Come out, little one. Don't be afraid." She waited without moving until Biscuit cautiously approached, sniffed her fingers, sat, and placed one paw in her hand. The woman smiled with genuine gentleness. Something about the interaction made me suspicious. She was not reacting to him like everyone else did. No reverence, no fear, no assumption that he was a legendary monster compressed into a tiny body. I wondered whether she knew he was not a Vera. She looked directly at me and winked. Then she said she had seen too many things in her life to be surprised anymore. I did not like how close that sounded to mind reading. She picked Biscuit up and tucked him against her chest. He immediately relaxed with a sigh. Traitor number 2. Only after thoroughly inspecting all of us did she finally introduce herself. Her name was Anana, a name she had chosen in honor of her favorite fruit, pineapple. In her opinion, the fruit suited her perfectly. Sweet, sharply acidic, tropical, and impossible to ignore. She was not wrong. We introduced ourselves in turn, including Biscuit. Anana immediately decided we sounded like a breakfast bowl. Rinka, whose name meant pear, was apparently now her fruit sister. By that point, even Rinka was laughing, and some of her dread about the neighborhood had disappeared. Anana led us into the empty shop. Calling the place shabby was generous. The space was smaller than my old single-room apartment. The floor was damaged badly enough that holes opened in several places. Dampness clung to the walls. Dust covered everything. If we installed a counter, there would only be enough room for 1 or 2 customers at once. Still, the structure itself seemed usable. It needed repairs, cleaning, decoration, shelving, and probably more repairs after we discovered what the cleaning uncovered. But years of odd jobs had taught me not to fear physical work. I had also wasted enough of my life decorating houses in simulation games to feel unreasonably confident about interior design. The real problem was rent. 50 gold every month would destroy us if we also had to pay for materials and lodging. Anana looked around the room as though seeing the neglect properly for the first time and admitted the place was much worse than she remembered. That was when she offered us a deal. If we repaired and improved the storefront ourselves, she would reduce the rent to 20 gold a month. That alone changed everything. And then she remembered one more detail. There was a living space above the shop. For another 10 gold per month, plus the possibility of unspecified favors she might ask of us later, we could rent that too. Biscuit sneezed. And Anana immediately declared that he had accepted the deal on our behalf. Nobody argued. 30 gold for both the business and a place to live was far better than anything we had expected. We would no longer need separate rooms at an inn. I could finally stop sleeping on the floor. The shop needed work, but work was something all of us understood. Rinka smiled, Sela smiled, and I probably had the stupidest grin of all. A month earlier, I had arrived in this world as a level 1 failure whose dog had accidentally received every heroic blessing meant for him. Since then, I had been worshipped, exposed, expelled from a village, nearly killed by flying rabbits, forced to admit the truth to the woman I liked, watched Biscuit save my life, watched him nearly collapse from saving it, gained a healer who had been thrown out by her church, and spent weeks taking low-level guild work just to collect startup money. None of it resembled the glorious Isekai adventure I had imagined after waking in that white room. I still had no class, no combat skill, no impressive level, and no divine weapon. But I had Biscuit, Rinka, and Sela. And now, beside the loudest brothel landlord in Valdora, we had a broken little storefront and the beginning of a plan. Tomorrow, our new business would begin.